All right, here to help us break down all of the news surrounding former President Trump and the recent January 6th stuff with the special counsel, the documents case, and some of the news that happened last week, plus the Hunter Biden plea deal. I want to learn more about it. So joining us right now, Neama Rahmani, former Assistant U.S. Attorney, President of West Coast Trial Lawyers. Neama, Mike, Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Of course, Mike, Nick, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Listen, Neama, I reached out to you and your folks because I've been seeing you across ABC News. I mean, I forget what other channels and outlets you've been breaking a lot of this stuff down. You're a former Assistant U.S. Attorney. There's been so much legal news around the former president of the United States, right? And it's really hard for a lot of people to keep up with stuff, especially because I feel like, and I say this as somebody that worked in the media space, a lot of the times the networks start to hype this stuff up. And the big thing that they hyped up was this potential January 6th investigation with the special counsel, the former president getting a target letter and him thinking that an indictment would be coming soon. We didn't get that, but we got something added on to the documents case that the former president was charged with down here in Miami, where I live, actually, funny enough. So why don't you take our audience a little bit inside what happened with all of that? Now the third defendant that's been named in the case. Can you break down a little bit of what transpired last week with respect to the documents case?
Well, we got a superseding indictment last week. So we got a new co-defendant and some new charges. So the new charges relate to one additional Espionage Act charge, which really that's just another document, right? And that's the Iran attack document that everyone's reported on. But what was really more important are a couple additional obstruction counts. And it relates to an incident where allegedly, at least, the former president asked one of his employees to destroy video. And that video would have shown the boxes of classified documents being moved. So we also got a new co-defendant, and that's Mr. Carlos de Oliveira, who's now wrapped up in all this. So obviously, we learned Walt Nauda's name for the first time during the initial indictment, and now we have another employee. So whenever you have these, I don't want to use the wrong term, but these are lower level individuals, right? This isn't the main target of special counsel Jack Smith. There's going to be a lot of pressure on them to flip on the former president. They're going to look at years in prison. And although Trump is paying for their legal bills, at the end of the day, whenever you're deciding, hey, do I cooperate, cut a deal, avoid federal prison time, or do I remain loyal? 9 times out of 10, most people flip under that kind of pressure.
We're at a time now where we've seen so much activity from the special counsel's office, this current one, that it seems pretty much a good time to compare what we've seen going on, under Jack Smith, as opposed to what we saw earlier with Robert Mueller, in terms of just their going away about pursuing the truth and where they want to move forward. Obviously, Mueller's work leads to a report, and where Smith is going seems to be a little bit more to a courtroom. What's your assessment about just the different approaches that these two gentlemen have had, and where are you in terms of the amount of fact-finding of where this leads to in terms of charges and the like? What seems different this time around as a special counsel is focusing on this particular former president?
Well, yeah, I mean, whenever you're dealing with, committees or prosecutors, there's ones that can make recommendations and there's ones that can actually do things, right? So you look at, for instance, Mueller, it's really, it's great, you conduct these investigations, you make recommendations, but, prosecutions require an attorney, a prosecutor is willing to act on those recommendations. So, I kind of go back to the January 6th committee. There was a lot of time and effort spent on that, and they did great work. But unless there's a prosecutor who's willing to pick up that baton and run with it, it doesn't mean a whole lot. So now you have special counsel Jack Smith, who's willing to do that. And for years, obviously, I've been covering Trump since, the 2020 election and the Capitol riots and all that. And I always said to myself, is there someone who's willing to take on the most politically charged prosecution in American history, charging a former president? And that initial prosecutor was Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. But now you're having Jack Smith, who's the first to federally indict a former president, at least once in one case, and I fully expect him to be indicted very soon in a matter of days, if not weeks, related to the 2020 election as well.
Neama, you kind of fed into the follow-up there, because I was going to ask you, you mentioned Alvin Bragg. There's so many different cases surrounding the former president. To the layperson, it could seem like arduous. There's so many different things. The calendar for next year is going to be swamped with respect to cases. And I wanted to kind of break down a little bit from your lens, legal perspective, if you were advising the former president, right? He's got the 2 civil trials, a documents case, the New York case with Alvin Bragg. If he's a client of yours, are you working in conjunction with some of his other attorneys in some of these cases, even though they don't pertain to each other? It's the former president's running for the current office of the presidency. So a lot of the stuff that he's saying in public about these cases could be used against him in a court of law. Can you take our audience a little bit inside the lawyer aspect of this, of, wrangling all of this stuff that the former president is facing, and how would you advise it or handle it if you were working for him?
If I were advising the president, I'd tell him 2 things. First, pay my bills. And second, follow my advice, because here's someone who's notorious for not doing either. I'll set aside the civil cases for a moment, because obviously Trump has said things that has gotten into civil trouble. Even after the defamation verdict, he sort of doubled down and potentially is going to have to pay even more damages. But let's put those aside, because we all know, when it comes to money, that's a lot less serious than the criminal cases. We have 2 right now, and I fully expect there to be 4. A second federal indictment, and an indictment there in Atlanta. Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis is probably going to indict Donald Trump sometime in August. But if I'm analyzing the cases as they exist now, the 2 criminal cases, I have to say the Manhattan case is a lot less serious than the classified documents case for a couple of reasons. First, the potential penalties in state court are usually less. But I think Trump has a ready-made defense there, because New York law is unique in that for a false business record to be a felony, it has to be in furtherance of or to cover up another crime. So we're talking about payments made to Stormy Daniels. Trump has, and I think will continue to argue, that he made those payments to save his family from embarrassment, as opposed to wanting to make a illegal campaign contribution. It's sort of a convoluted argument the Manhattan DA is making. So I think there's a real possibility that case gets reduced from a felony to a misdemeanor, or at least Trump has a good legal argument there. I don't think he has a real good leg to stand on there in South Florida, where you live, because really, he's admitted knowledge and intent. He's gone out in Truth Social. He said, hey, I knew the documents were classified. I could declassify them. Well, that's great if your argument works. But if not, you're admitting knowledge and intent. You're admitting to breaking the law. And now that you have this evidence where he's asking his employees to allegedly delete evidence, that's not something innocent people do. So given the seriousness of the case, given the potential maximum sentence on the obstruction, it's 20 years. On some of the Espionage Act, you're looking at 10 years, false statements, 5 years, but you're looking at years in federal prison. Even on the advisory sentencing guidelines, it's at least 3-4 years. That case is a lot more serious. And if I'm advising Donald Trump, that's the case I said you got to take the most seriously, because that's the one that may, cause you to end up in federal prison, even though you have a favorable judge in Judge Cannon.
Quick break from our pod to tell you about a new pod at Fresh Roasted Coffee, Envy Pods. So if you go to freshroastedcoffee.com, my partner's shaking his head. That's a good transition. Are you crazy?
It was good. No, I shook my head. I was like, that's brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because I saw this picture earlier. I was like, I saw what you're doing.
It is pretty good. That's right. So listen, the new Envy Pods over at freshroastedcoffee.com, the official sponsor of Can We Please Talk, environmentally safe, compostable. You can go check these out at freshroastedcoffee.com. When you open up the package, it smells delicious. I'm telling you, you can't smell it on here, but I promise you that when I opened this morning to make my cup of coffee, it was delicious. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. Use the promo code CANWEGET20 for 20% off your first order, or hit the link in our show details.
Neema, it's funny. I think we've had a few other legal experts on this show, and it seems like we've always asked that question to every single person. If you're going to advise the president, which tells you, as a former president, like, that's a lot of need for legal advice. That said, supporters of the president have talked about all of these attempts at prosecution and all these legal efforts to, quote unquote, go after the former president. Seems to be examples of what would be considered the quote unquote weaponization of the government. As someone who has sat in the prosecutor's desk before, can you just take us through at a global level, these these indictments or where we're heading toward trial and the such, just from the standpoint of of legality, where is the facts living here? And in your estimation, is if I'm drawing a pie chart of these different cases, what sliver of this feels political and what of this feels like just sound legal approaches to addressing someone who may have committed a crime?
Look, obviously, we're dealing with a very unique case, unprecedented, so where law and politics intersect. But what I tell people, and I'm sure we're going to talk about Hunter Biden and others. I may be a Democrat, but I'm a law and order Democrat. So if someone breaks the law, I don't care who they are. If you're Hillary, if you're Hunter, if you're Donald Trump, you should be prosecuted. But let's just take the documents case and explain why Donald Trump is being prosecuted here. This isn't a situation where Mike Pence or Joe Biden had some classified documents and they cooperated with the archives to get those documents back. Here's someone in Donald Trump who, for more than 1 year, the archives asked for the documents to be returned. He ignored them. The archives said, hey, if you don't comply, we're going to make a referral to the Department of Justice. We all know these executive agencies, they can't enforce the law. They got to make the referral. Still, even without warning, Trump doesn't return the documents. Of course, DOJ gets involved. They issue a grand jury subpoena. And what does Donald Trump do? At least allegedly, he hides the documents, right? He has moved from his storage to his personal residence. I mean, it's really one of those cases where the cover-up is worse than the crime, and we have a nation of laws. So had Trump done the right thing, had he cooperated with his lawyers, had he just got the documents back to where they belong, we wouldn't be here. So, that's how I distinguish this case, at least with respect to the documents, from Pence and Joe Biden and others who may have mishandled classified documents.
Neema, you're feeding perfectly into these follow-ups because you just mentioned Hunter Biden. We are going to discuss Hunter Biden here because the current president right now is kind of being painted with the same brush as the former president was in terms of the business dealings that he's had with his sons, right? To a lesser extent, and it's different, obviously, the Trump organization versus what President Biden did after he left the vice presidency back in 2016. But my question for you is, for the people out there listening and watching, Hunter Biden has become like the ire of everybody. And he recently got this plea deal, which there was a couple of charges there. No jail time was probably going to be served out of this. And then the plea deal kind of fell through and the judge just did not like the terms of it. Or I would love for you to take our audience inside what the original charges were and then what fell through with the plea deal and kind of where does it stand right now? Because it seems like the judge was saying, if you're still investigating this individual, then you can't have him accept this type of plea deal if more charges are going to come down the pipe. Am I oversimplifying that? Am I getting that wrong? What can you explain about the Hunter Biden plea deal and how this went wrong?
Yeah, you're getting it right. So, just taking a step back, I can tell you my position is Hunter Biden got an amazing deal. I mean, that's not something that's typical in our federal system. And I always like to say I put more than 1,000 people in jail, and I never once gave a pretrial diversion deal. Misdemeanors on the federal system are pretty rare in and of itself, but diversion is just not something you see. So Hunter Biden got an amazing deal. Maybe he had great lawyers, maybe he cooperated, but for whatever reason, he should be thanking his attorneys. Now, let's just talk about what went wrong last week. So let's separate the plea agreement from the diversion agreement. So there's two different documents we're dealing with. So once the deal was announced, Hunter Biden's lawyers came out publicly and said, this resolves all the federal investigations into Hunter Biden. Now, that was not documented in the plea agreement. And so the plea agreement is filed with the court. The judge has to read it, approve it, and that type of thing. It may have been in the diversion agreement. I don't know, because the diversion agreement is between the defendant and the government, the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's an agreement not to prosecute, essentially, if you comply with the terms of the agreement. So it's not a court document. So the first issue that we dealt with was during the plea agreement, you have the judge asking, hey, does this resolve everything? The government saying, well, no, not necessarily. You have Hunter Biden's lawyers who are saying, yeah, it does. So there's really no meeting of the minds, and that hadn't been ironed out. Well, that's something that should have been taken care of beforehand if you have the criminal defendant's lawyer saying this resolves everything. If you disagree with that, if you're the government, you got to make sure that that's very clear. You don't want a defendant, regardless of whether it's Hunter Biden or anyone, pleading to something that they don't understand or where there's some sort of disagreement. The other issue, the second issue, it's a constitutional issue. It's a separation of powers issue. Whenever you're dealing with prosecution or non-prosecution, that's an agreement between the executive branch, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, Weiss's office, who was appointed by Trump, and the defendant. It's not proper for Congress, the legislative branch, to get involved, and it's not proper for the judiciary to get involved. So the issue was, in terms of complying with diversion, the parties didn't trust each other, so they asked the judge to make a ruling whether Hunter Biden was going to ultimately comply with the terms of the diversion such that the addict in possession charge goes away. Well, that's not appropriate for a judge to do, just like it's not appropriate for a House committee to get involved and file motions in the case. So the judge is saying, listen, I can't do this. This is unconstitutional. And that's why we had the two issues in the case. But I can tell you this, Hunter Biden's lawyers are going to want that deal because it's a very good deal. And if Joe Biden doesn't get reelected, I can tell you that another U.S. attorney may take a very different view and prosecute Hunter Biden a lot more aggressively.
Neama, to that end, a criticism that comes up in this case is the idea that it can be perceived as a two-tiered legal system. That what Hunter Biden is getting or experiencing is not necessarily the case for the average citizen. That's, again, something that's put out there, but just from a legal standpoint, and you were talking about that before. I mean, Hunter's got great lawyers, and this is, working out favorably from in this instance, and maybe not so much with a different judge in this case. But does that feel like an accurate assessment, though, that if this is not the president's son, perhaps the way that this situation plays out may result in jail or a more harsher penalty?
Potentially. I mean, obviously, Hunter Biden has access to funds and a lot better lawyers than your average Joe. But if you're looking at the charges themselves, addict in possession is rarely charged on its own. It's something that's usually tacked on to other crimes. And when you're dealing with tax issues, failure to file, most people, they resolve those types of cases administratively at the audit phase, or the IRS will file a civil lawsuit. There's not a whole lot of tax cases that really rise to the level of criminal prosecution. So, on one hand, I agree that this is a good deal, but on the other, I can say that these types of charges aren't typically prosecuted at the federal level. And you have a U.S. attorney that was appointed by Trump. Biden kept him on in Weiss, and he continued this investigation well into Biden's tenure. So I don't think a lot of conservatives can really criticize Weiss's handling of this case. I mean, they might not like the results, but again, here's someone that was appointed by Trump. So, it's not like Joe Biden got involved. He didn't pardon his son. He didn't fire the U.S. attorney who was handling the case. So, all in all, I think it was really Weiss's decision, and there's not a whole lot that any of us can do about it.
Neama Rahmani is a former assistant U.S. attorney. You can check him out, West Coast Trial Lawyers. Neama, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today and breaking down everything with former President Trump, Hunter Biden. Continued success to you, sir. Please stay safe.
Thanks, Mike. Great. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.